these are on if you want to borrow one of these.
All right. How's that? Thank you, all of you, for being here today. I know that this semester has been quite a whirlwind, literally and figuratively, with hurricanes, tornadoes, natural disasters, political disasters. Is it on?
Yes.
Okay. I'll just keep using this. So in this context, I'm particularly mindful of how our students, faculty, and staff have been feeling. I think it's really important to keep these feelings front and center. We've been having a lot of conversation about free speech, universities as marketplaces of ideas, and the importance of engaging in intellectual debate about ideas. While that is certainly important, I think it's also dangerous to spotlight that part of the conversation, but lose sight of the deep, real feelings of pain, anger, and fear that many of us are feeling. In that context, I think the work that these students have been doing over the past year or so, beginning with the research at the presidential inauguration, the Women's March, and then this March for Equality and Pride, really models the best aspirations of what it means for a university to be a marketplace of ideas. What the work that these students have been doing, the goal really is to deepen understanding and empathy for the real experiences of people, to help us understand those experiences, help us understand the activism and community building that people are doing, that rather than hateful, dehumanizing speech, I think is what the aspirations of a university and the aspirations of free speech reflect. So for that, I'm really, really appreciative for the work that you all have been doing, for the timeliness of this presentation in particular. And I want to give a special shout out to Robert and to Holland, whose tenacious commitment to making this trip happen, making this panel presentation and many other efforts happen. Without their work and commitment, this would not have happened. I also want to thank Ryan Morini and Paul Ortiz, our partners at Samuel Proctor Oral History Program, because again, without you, this wouldn't have happened. And I really look forward to continuing to do this type of social justice, oral history work with you. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ortiz for a few comments, and then we'll have the students take over.
Thank you, Dr. Moradi. And those of you, I see some familiar faces in the audience by now, know this is becoming a familiar intellectual exercise. Women's studies and oral history and women's studies. It's these types of collaborations that make these types of field work opportunities for our students possible. So I want to thank Dr. Moradi and Women's Studies, Donna for being I was going to say the best office manager at the University of Florida, tied with Tamara Jenkins, our Proctor program office manager. The two best. It helps to have the two best office managers in the campus. Wouldn't you agree, Dr. Moradi? Because the staff really make it work. They rent the vehicles, they reserve the hotel rooms. Without them, the logistics couldn't happen. I was thinking about this panel, and again, just to echo what Bonnie was saying, really to thank Robert and Holland for keeping us moving forward, and so many others. But I was also thinking, Bonnie, to the origins of the Florida Queer History Project in the oral history program. And I believe it goes back to 2 summers ago, the terrible, horrific tragedy, the Pulse nightclub massacre. At that time, we had a team. I was leading a field team, an oral history field team in the Mississippi Delta, and we were out conducting interviews. And Holland, you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe that either you or Chelsea Carnes called us in Mississippi and said, we need to do something. We need to start a queer history project, and it needs to be sustained and serious. It needs to reflect what's happening in the state of Florida and in this country. And I immediately thought, why didn't we already have a queer history project? And we have to take responsibility for not having it at that time. But I'm so glad that we moved forward from that point, and I just want to emphasize that because these programs and projects are really student generated. They're student centered. We do these things in women's studies and in oral history because our students are really demanding the right, and again, echoing what Dr. Moradi said earlier, to engage in the world around us, to use the tools we teach and learn on the university campus to understand what's happening in the broader world. The second impetus for the Queer History Project, I believe, and especially for the trip, comes from, and again, Dr. Moradi mentioned the momentum, kind of the social movement momentum following up from the National Women's March on Washington. And this is an important lesson for academics, that as long as we're open and responsive to popular movements around us, whether they be local or regional or national or even international, that's what we should be doing. We should understand the world is changing rapidly. Nothing stays the same. And I'm just so thrilled to be able now to turn the floor over to this great panel, except the only, I guess, 2 more things I just want to say is, please continue to engage in the work that you all are doing. Because as I look out of the audience, I don't know all of you, but I do know some of you, and I know all of you are doing really vital work, whether it be in queer history, women's studies, whether you're a graduate student or undergraduate student in any one of those fields. This is the most important time in our nation's history to be pursuing women's studies, to be pursuing queer studies, to be pursuing transgender studies. It's absolutely vital that we really engage with the world. So I want to thank the panel in advance for doing just that and being excellent role models. And I need to turn the mic over to Aliya Miranda. All right. Thank you, Aliya.
I think this one's working now. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aliya Miranda, the Digital Productions Coordinator at the Oral History Program. Today we're going to be showing you a few clips from the oral history fieldwork that we conducted at DC Pride Weekend back in June. We'll be reflecting on the experiences of documenting these events day by day, as well as sharing what we think we've been able to do with this collection since coming back from the trip. And we hope that this showcase of our fieldwork encourages other scholars like you to use this collection and explore it, and in your own research and your digital productions projects to educate the public and empower the LGBT community. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce our panel. So we have Robert Baez. Robert is a PhD student in the Department of Sociology and Criminology and Law at the University of Florida. Robert completed his BA degree in Public Communication at Florida Atlantic University, where he focused on community organizing and social movements. Received his MA degree in Women's Studies from the Center for Gender, Sexuality, and Women's Studies Research at the University of Florida, and Robert's research interests focus generally on the intersection between gender, sexuality, and race. We have Holland Hall, who's over here. Holland graduated from UF magna cum laude in the spring of 2016 with a Bachelor's of Arts in History. And after graduating, she began working at SPOP at UF. She co-founded the Programs for the Queer History Project in June of 2016 and served as the research coordinator for the program's Women's March on Washington Experiential Learning Fieldwork trip in collaboration with Center for Gender Sexuality and Women's Studies Research. She's currently pursuing her MED/BPS degree in mental health counseling at the University of Florida and is a digital and public humanities intern at the Baez Library. And then we have Matt Bratko. He is an MFA acting candidate in the School of Theater and Dance at the University of Florida. He hails from the West Coast, where he did his undergraduate in theater and performance studies and political science at UC Berkeley. And he's a performer, producer, and activist, and was privileged, his own words, to work with SPOP on both the Women's March and the Equality March Fieldwork trips. And we have Brenda Stroud, and she is an undergraduate history major. She's been conducting SPOP fieldwork since fall 2017, including the MFP inauguration, and the Women's March trip. She founded the Confederate Monuments of America project at SPOP. Her senior thesis research explores counter-narratives in Confederate memorialization. And then we have Kendra Blanton, and she is an aspiring human rights attorney. She's a Latin American Studies and religion double major focused on addressing economic inequality and sustainable development in Latin America. And she is currently an intern at SPOP. So I'm going to turn it over to Robert, who's going to be talking a little bit about the Queer History Project.
Sure. So I will keep it short because they've already kind of talked about the origins of where this project came from. But essentially, Holland and I were really inspired by the work that we were able to do in Washington for the Women's March on Washington. And so when we heard that our own community, the queer community, was organizing to do a similar march in June, we felt it was very important for us to kind of band together again with SPOP and the Center for Women's Studies and Gender Research, and get a research team out there on the ground and document what happened over the weekend. And so that's where we are going to pick up off of where we are today, really highlight some narratives that we thought were important from the bunch, and kind of just give an overview of the different events that we were able to attend. And I guess another thing that is important to note is that we were really interested in engaging with narratives that are less often heard within the queer community. And so that's what you're going to see highlighted again today throughout the presentation.
So we're going to be going through this day by day. Our first evening in the Capitol, we split up into two teams to document the experience of the teams at two separate events. The first was the No Justice, No Pride Night March in the Logan Circle. This event was advertised as DC's queer and trans community uniting to march against the corporatization of pride, marching through DC's neighborhoods, celebrating their identities, resisting hate, bigotry, and honoring queer and trans heroes of the past, basically to protest Capitol Pride. So I'm going to turn it over to Matt to talk about that experience.
Hi, I'm Matt. I would say teams is a strong word, because of the havoc wreaked on DC traffic by the parade, and because of logistical concerns, I ended up sort of jumping out of the van with a camera and running around trying to capture as much of the experience as I could. It was fantastic. We didn't know that this was the march was protesting the parade that was happening at the same time. So it was actually, that was the night of the Pride Parade, and then the Equality March was the next day. So it was unnerving at first to try to sort of figure out what was going on. But I made my way I eventually found the protesters who had been sort of barricaded in by the cops. And at that point, it had dwindled to a group of about, I would say, 50 or 60 protesters that were completely surrounded by cops. And they were outside, I think, of Lockheed Martin, because one of the things they were protesting was the inclusion of companies that profit off of violence as sponsors of the march. So just a little background. DC is the queer culture in DC has for a long time been heavily dominated by white cis acting gay males. And especially like in the gay bars in DC and the gayborhoods are very white. It's a huge issue about like race and class. So coming into it, I knew that those were tensions that were at play. So I wanted to try to get as many perspectives of the people who are attempting to participate in the queer movement in DC, despite the discrimination that's historically been waged against them, both within and without their community. What else should I say about this?
Let's play the clip.
Yeah, play the clips.
Basically, there was no police zone with the people doing the No Justice, No Pride march, and there were a bunch of cops around, just being really smug and being really like extra and aggressive, and they were just chanting and then talking about like the real history of Pride. People like to whitewash it, people like to cis-wash it, but like Pride was run by a black trans woman and like her fellow sex workers, and people like to fucking erase that and add a bunch of fucking cops to it. And there just shouldn't be cops at Pride. Like Pride was an anti-cop riot. So like that was basically it. They were just being really aggressive, not really wanting to go anywhere. They ended up leaving and they're going to another location right now, I believe. And then there's like a bunch of just like trash allies who are saying that cops are the real heroes when like we all know that shit is not true. So I don't know, I was just really happy to see some of the young kids coming out and saying the fucking truth. I just think that they're really the future. Like I see the young queer kids and they're just so much more radical. And even like, I feel like I'm pretty radical, but these kids are out here doing the real fucking work. So yeah, that's it.
Yeah.
Why are you participating here today? Literally because of the literal word of pride. Means owning your truth, feeling comfortable in your own skin. I'm not something easy. It's very difficult to get to that point, and I'm still on that journey. I'm getting there, and it really feels good. It feels great. And when you have camaraderie and like people that you love and that you feel connected to, that's what. How do you think you've changed since you came out? It's still a progress. In a way, it's still a battle. Like, you're still figuring out yourself and you're still trying to fit into society. And it's not the easiest thing. But you want to. You want to be a productive member of society. You want to be... I don't want to say what I'm in, but I want to say that you really want to be a member of society that just works hard and really wants to wants to work with people, and that can get a little bit frustrating at times. But the fight keeps on, and you just can't give up. You just can't give up.
Yeah, so I got to talk to a lot of really incredible young queer people of color who were trying to articulate and find their place in the movement. That particular interview is interesting because he's attempting to articulate something very complicated about intersectionality and assimilation, but he was also like tanked at the time. So he was really awesome. I liked him a lot. Yeah, I think that's what I have to say about that night.
Great.
Yeah.
We're going to move on to the second team that was at the Queer Trans Night of Healing and Resistance. It was also a part of No Justice, No Pride. It was an event in collaboration with the Trans Women of Color Collective. And it was advertised as a celebration open to all, as a healing and community-led space in which to enjoy food, entertainment, art, and opportunities to connect with local LGBTQ+ groups and individuals. It was completely funded by donations, and we were fortunate enough to have our own table set up where attendees could come up to us, sign up, and conduct interviews So we're going to turn it over to Tico
Mhm.
to reflect on these. But should we play the
Yeah,
first?
if you can play it, I can talk after.
Can you briefly tell me how you came to identify as a Black trans woman?
Oh, sure. Long story short, it was something that I took my time on. I did not trust nor believe it at first. I was extremely afraid of it.
At what age was this?
When did I learn what being transgender was? I was about 20.
Okay.
21.
Okay.
Because before then, I was just used to getting, because I have a natural feminine feature, because I'm about almost like about 2 years on hormones. So
Congratulations.
Thank you. I naturally was already getting the attention as if I was already a woman, and I didn't know how to deal with that. No matter how hard I tried to deal with it, like overshadow it. And then it was honestly my mother and my sister who told me to go ahead and do it. Like, it makes more sense. They could see me, they like, just go ahead and be a girl. And so, I just took my time and went from being a straight man to a bi man to a gay man to an androgynous man to now being a Black trans woman. So it just took my time and made sure I loved myself through each process. Yeah.
So we met Aurora at this event because she was actually singing. She was performing. She's a singer, songwriter, a local activist. She's really engaged with the community in DC. And so after speaking with her for a few minutes, we had it was initially going to be a few minutes, but then we started talking for like an hour, because we clicked and we were wanting to know more about her story and her experiences, particularly in the DC area. And Aurora was also a speaker at the Equality March. She was maybe not headlining, but she was one of the featured speakers. And so the next day, the day after this event, the day after we met Aurora, we met up with her at her apartment, and we kind of, again, just really tried to get to know her, what her day-to-day experience was like. And we learned a lot. One of the things I would say that I took away from it is just her determination to be who she sees as herself. And one of the questions that stick out to me that we did not just play is that I asked her what was one of the things that she wants to see improve for Black trans women in the United States. And her answer was simply living past the age of 35, because that is the age that Black trans women, the average age, their lifespan is until that age. And so it made us definitely think about what we can do as a society to kind of encourage and push along those particular narratives in our community. So again, just the goal of this was to continue to kind of shed light on the narratives that are often less told, and I think that this is certainly one of them. Does anybody else have anything they'd like to add about that particular event?
Yeah, so I did some interviews at that event as well. One of the interviews that I did that was really impactful was an interview with a non-binary person. This has all been a learning experience for me, and being welcomed into that space was, it was a wake-up call to me, and that interview specifically, because that person identified with pronouns ze, they, zir, and they talked about being a teacher, a middle school teacher of history, and they told their students to address them in those pronouns. Parents complained, and they were brought into the principal's office and eventually fired for pushing a political agenda. There are laws in place that they cannot be discriminated for their gender identity, but that didn't take effect or matter in that case. So what I took away from that is legislation doesn't really matter people don't know how to enforce it and aren't trained in how to recognize when those rights are infringed upon. And something that was a constant theme that I was constantly faced with was the fact that we're straight people are constantly think that after marriage equality, that was basically it, and we're done, and we solved the issue. When there are so many other LGBT issues that are not even looked at. So that was a really impactful interview experience for me. And if anybody else has anything from that day. Okay, so I think we can move on to the next day, which is the day of the Equality March for Unity.
Well, there's one more.
Oh, there's one more. Okay, there's one more clip that we have to share.
Yeah, and so this kind of goes along with what we just talked about, like non-binary identity, just personally how I identify. So the fact that we were able to collect stories such as Aliya just shared, kind of highlighting that identity, was like really important to me. And so Nate is going to talk a little bit about how that's played out.
So my sister came out as a lesbian, and that eventually was acceptable. But mom was very hesitant. And mom was openly hostile whenever I'd present them or dress them. So that became a big issue. And I don't really talk to mom anymore, and I don't imagine I will again. So that's just that. And then in relationships, it sort of created a weird dynamic. It's difficult to find people that are understanding, knowledgeable.
Yeah, so I've also experienced kind of the things that Nate was just discussing as far as it being okay to be gay or to love someone of the same sex. But then when it comes to presenting femme, and of course, it's more acceptable in society, it seems, I dress the way I do, than for people who are assigned male at birth to dress femme. And so Nate was just talking about how his mother dealt with that, and like the lesbianism is cool, whatever. But presenting femme is like, that breaks off our relationship. And also talking about just relationships, because you don't see that many people who are assigned male at birth and present femme and be accepted as like non-binary or like not trans per se. So just speaking to like the dating pool that you have to choose from dwindles based on just the representation and visibility in our culture and society. So yeah, that was another interview from that night and at that event. So we can go on to the next day now.
Cool. So the next day was the Equality March for Unity in Pride. Holland was actually fortunate enough to meet up with the organizers of the event. She happened upon them, and she can talk about some of the interviews that she got with those organizers.
Yeah, sure. Do I have your microphone? Yeah. I do? I do? Okay, yeah. It's so saturated on this side, okay, so I will come up to the Thank you. Yeah, sorry about that. So this is actually a page from our zine, which we'll talk about a little bit later as far as what we did with this research and how we've gotten that out to the public. But as you can see, these are all just people I stumbled upon, and we took portraits of them, and we did more full-length interviews. This just kind of highlights some of the interviews that we caught. These people on the left here, in the center is David Brunage, and he actually founded the march. He says he was inspired by the Women's March, was watching Women's March on TV, and said we need that for our community. And then also, so Ashley Smith and Jose Plaza were national co-chairs. And we also have an interview later with Catalina Velasquez, who was also a national co-chair. But they're kind of like really active in DC and helped shape the areas of interest that they wanted to highlight at the march. And then on the right are volunteers. So we just kind of got out there. I mean, they were at the entrance, or like right where the metro kind of like spat out, and right where the march was starting. And we got there, Kendra and Brenda and I. and just started interviewing people. It was incredible to stumble upon like the founder of the march and then all these people who had been dedicating time for months and months to make this possible. So, like I said, this is in our zine, and we can talk about that a little bit later, but we'll go ahead and move on.
I think you should play the clip, and then we can. Dun dun dun.
Please hold. We are experiencing technical difficulties.
Just give you guys like just a little bit about this person. This is Catalina Velázquez. She's a trans Latina immigrant from Colombia, and she's the director of Young People Forward, which is a one-year fellowship program at Oliver's, actually. Yeah, she was one of the organizers for this event. And
Is it the computer or the?
Did the projector turn off?
Yeah.
The projector's
Maybe
not
a
on.
reset. Yeah.
yeah, do you want to talk a little bit about the zine?
Sure, I can do that. So a lot of the ideas behind the trip was to not collect all of these amazing narratives and stories and experiences and then put them in an archive where they would collect dust essentially and nobody access them. So a lot of our work at SPOP has been to get this information out to the public through public programming. And one of those ideas that we came up with was incorporating a zine. And so zines in this capacity have been used very often in feminist organizing to create community and disseminate information that people may not have access to otherwise. And so the zine was along the same idea. We incorporated resources to our local community here in Gainesville. So if queer people didn't know where to go for this particular thing, they could look at the resource guide and go from there. We incorporated quotes from the interviews. We also had a call for artists, for queer artists to submit their own work. And so again, allowing each other the space to tell your own stories was a lot of the idea behind the zine. So I'm gonna throw it back over and let's listen to Catalina.
Catalina Velázquez. And can you tell me your involvement in this march? So I'm one of the national co-chairs. I'm an undocumented transgender Latina, and I'm very proud to be part of senior leadership because we can't afford to keep the T silent. And as a transgender woman, we need to ensure that transgender representation goes beyond tokenism. And as a strategic planner, driving the communications and the various issue area platforms, we could see not just the most diverse cohort of co-chairs, but we can also celebrate one of the most intersectional agendas put forward in a space like this that celebrates people of all walks of life, but that shows that fighting anti-blackness is a queer transgender issue, that undocumented immigrants like myself, that immigration is a transgender queer issue, disability, abortion as a trans and queer issue. I think that these are not the traditional topics of conversation that have been driving what LGBTQ liberation looks like. And so I'm here as one of the national co-chairs and very excited for today. And so politics is what I breathe, it's what I do, and it's my opportunity to fight for the liberation of 11.2 million undocumented immigrants living in this country, of over 700,000 transgender people, openly transgender people living in this country, and for the not open, we have yet to have more research to know, but this gives you some idea of where we're at and in this country, where Latino demographics are growing, 26 million Latinas living in this country. I can't afford but to highlight populations of all my identities to ensure that we're all walking towards liberation and not a trickle-down approach to equality.
Sure. So every time I listen to that clip, I get chills and just so excited, because I think that's exactly at the core of kind of the methodology behind this project, being really inclusive and thinking about how all of our identities are overlapping, and being very thoughtful and conscientious of those things. And so I think, particularly at what Catalina is getting at, is that in order to ensure that with such a vast community as the queer community, we all look different and act different and have different identities. And so in order to really move forward, we have to kind of bring, lock arms and move forward together in that way, or else we're not really liberating anybody. We're just kind of contributing to other systems of oppression and not really getting at the issues. And so, I was really inspired when I heard Catalina speak and what she had to contribute.
I am one of the marriage equality lawyers. I represented Heather Brassner in a case in Broward County, Florida, which was the first same-sex divorce granted in the state of Florida about 3 weeks before we got same-sex marriage.
So, as an attorney, what are the next legal challenges that you feel need to be faced for this community?
Well, the biggest one for the entire community is discrimination. It's unthinkable that people would refuse and be allowed to refuse to give housing to somebody who's Black, Asian, Hispanic, yet they're allowed to discriminate against people who are LGBT. Same in the workplace. We have protections. There are arguments pending in the courts right now as to whether or not those protections extend to LGBT rights and whether sexual orientation discrimination is actually sex discrimination already barred by federal law. And we've had some really great decisions, and the Supreme Court is eventually going to weigh in pretty soon, so it should clear some of that up. You can get involved in the most minor kind of way without spending a dime or marching. By talking to other people, by calling people out when they say bigoted things against the LGBT community, and simply going, hey, you know what, I'm not okay with that.
So this interview was really interesting because when we talk about marriage equality, like Aliya mentioned, some people thought that was it. But as a divorce attorney, she was talking about how before marriage equality passed, problems and the darker side of relationships really came out. So she was telling me about one couple that was in an abusive relationship, and the victim of the abusive relationship was afraid to leave because he didn't know if he would have access to his adopted daughter, who of course was not actually his legally. He was afraid to leave, that he would lose his home, that he would lose his property, that he would be abused again by his partner. So that was a very interesting and eye-opening interview for me, because we typically think of Pride as such a beautiful, happy experience, but when you're in an abusive relationship, it gets very dark. So understanding her perspective of dealing with divorce cases was extremely interesting because it showed the alternative, darker side of Pride. Probably one of my favorite clips in her entire interview was that the only thing better than marrying the person you love is being able to divorce the person you hate. So that was really, really wonderful. And in addition, on her shirt, you see section 93 C to C. Essentially, that's the largest Pride flag that was ever created. I'm not quite sure how many miles long it was, but this particular section 93 has touched water both in the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, and it constantly travels. So we met with a group of those organizers in those shirts that were able to tell us all the different places that this Pride flag had gone. So that interview was really, really impactful in terms of understanding that marriage equality was just step one. There are so many more protections that we need to put in place for victims of domestic violence, for finding out not just how to marry the person you love, but also figure out the creation of new safe spaces for LGBT individuals. Do you have anything to add to that?
You want to add to that, Brenda?
Sure, I can if you'll let me.
Yeah.
So I was part of this interview as well as Catalina's, and I also interviewed a couple of other gentlemen that were part of the Section 93 flag who experienced themselves an abusive relationship. One of which was in the military, the leader of the Section 93 flag, I believe. He lived through the don't ask, don't tell laws, and was also experiencing an abusive relationship. There's a lot of things like that us as allies need to be able to understand and empathize with, that as we've continually said here today, there's much more to it than just the legalized marriage. There's the daily experience and the lack of social services and assistance in the community. So I think it's really important for us to all, try to understand and empathize as best we can.
So I actually just have like a little side note. I've never noticed this in the photo until I was just standing there and seeing it projected, but that's me in the background to the right of Nancy, and I'm purchasing, or I'm donating for some of these pins that they were wearing, and that actually, I was speaking to and buying these pins from a woman who currently lives in Orlando and is a physician who was called in the night of the Pole shooting, but also she's played basketball for UF, so I just thought that was like a really cool side note as far as like who all we saw in DC. It was great to see like people from UF there. And then like I was saying, these pins that they were wearing and donating were actually put together and assembled by survivors of the Pole shooting who were in the hospital working with this woman, getting this together for donations to the museum that will sit where the Pole's nightclub was. So just a little side note. And I'll try not to mess this thing up in a second. So we're going to play this clip and then he goes into a little bit about it.
Well, I would say, and I think this is something that's not talked about a lot, is that the foundation of who we are is our belief system. And so Bruce Lipton wrote a book called The Biology of Belief, and he studied cells. And in those cells, he said, when a cell is dying, change its environment. And when you change the cell's environment, it starts to adapt that healthy environment, and it starts to live and thrive. And that's the same thing that's kind of happened today. So like in the African American community, I always recommend, like people, if you're in an environment that's oppressive, change your environment. Go to an environment that's more positive, that has more opportunity for you, so that you can experience something healthy, something loving, more expansive than what you've experienced.
Great. Thank you so much for spending some time with us today.
No problem.
So I think first I would just like to acknowledge that is much easier said than done for many people. You can't just pick up your stuff and move. But I think getting down to like the core of what Mary is saying is just the need to create spaces for ourselves. And so again, I think that this project and the work that we've been able to do is trying to build queer spaces for queer people in our own community in Gainesville. And I guess as a side note, but related, we held an event, a Pride extravaganza at First Magnitude Brewery. And it was exciting for us, that collaboration, because it was the first event ever at First Magnitude that was solely dedicated to queer people or a queer event to that capacity. And so I think we're taking those words that we heard quite literally and taking it upon ourselves to build that queer community and queer space in our own space here at the university and in Gainesville.
Alright, so you can play this clip from Eve's Matthew.
Can
can you share with us what you're out here doing today?
I'm out here, so one of my good friends, Asher, was on a bus from the city that was coming here, and I'm really involved with activism and awareness, especially for marginalized groups, and I felt that being here as a person of color is just fucking important. Oh my God, can I curse? I'm so sorry. Okay, yeah. I just feel like it's just important because, like, representation is something that's, like, not prevalent, in most media outlets and anything, and I feel like young kids of color who happen to be queer need to see older kids of color out here, like, confident and doing what feels right, and not caring about what shade they are or where they came from. Just the fact that we all have something in common, and that's our community.
Awesome. What do you think that the community can be doing more to make it a more inclusive space for queer people of color?
Honestly, I feel like, when it comes to things like promotion for pride events or anything involving the LGBT community, the first thing you see is a chiseled white guy, blonde hair, blue eyes, and I feel like not all of us look like that, and it's just a really cool thing to show some kind of figure besides what we're used to. And someone shared a beautiful story with me a couple of days ago. There was a guy who cosplayed as a black Batman, and this young 4-year-old boy walked up to him and said, "Can I be a brown Batman as well?" And that's just one example of how much influence we actually have, and we don't realize it. And I feel like it shouldn't take, in 2017, a grown man dressing as a black Batman for kids to see that it can be something else besides what they see in the media,
So I did this interview, and what was really interesting about it to me was how, in that part that you listened to and the rest of it, he was kind of talking about how his very presence in this space, like, it wasn't, his being there wasn't just about being in a space with other people who share his identity, but being there as to kind of show a counter narrative to our culture's idea of a gay person or a queer person being chiseled white guy, as he put it. And he went on to talk about how Black trans women of color are disproportionately affected by violence and are targets of violence, victims of violence. And how our very narrow understanding of what it is to be queer kind of blinds us to all of these other issues that affect the queer community. Racism is a queer issue, and his being there is also about empowering queer kids of color to be proudly exactly who they are, and to see that they can be exactly who they are, the way that he has been able to come to terms with who he is. It made me come to a conclusion that your presence in a space like this, as someone who is underrepresented in the media, can serve as a protest in and of itself, which is really intriguing to me.
The Equality March was at least attempted to reflect the diversity of the LGBTQ community. Capital Pride, we felt, really did not. We felt it really attempted to impose upon more marginalized sections of our community an agenda articulated and defined by a upper middle class, white, cisgender, gay elite. And the LGBTQ movement can't be blind to other forms of oppression that are deeply linked to our own. I mean, this is a system, we live in a system that is based on preserving the power of a tiny elite that reaps enormous profits at the expense of the vast majority, and that does that by dividing and conquering, and keeping people from seeing the potential to fight together for a different kind of society. We live in a world where there's more than enough wealth to make sure everyone is fed, housed, and clothed, but that doesn't happen. So
David Thurston is kind of the best. He was What did he do for No Justice, No Pride? He was
an organizer.
He was an organizer. He was in charge of like the visuals of it, right? Yeah, he was like the artist. He did all this sort of like the visuals, and he was just this incredibly intelligent, passionate person. He's like an activist with No Justice, No Pride. He's like also a multimedia artist. Something that I love because he and I are both very open about our histories with like mental illness, and we're both like mental health activists. So I love that about him, and like, you know, socialist and everything. This was a wonderful interview. He let us come to his house and talk to him for a long time, and he talked about a lot of the structural inequality that's present in the queer movement. Like, we can see the queer movement as fighting for rights and for freedom, but a lot of the times the rights and the freedoms that are fought for by the queer movement are only particularly useful to a certain segment of the queer community. And there are huge parts of the queer community that aren't represented by the movement, that don't feel like they have a place in the movement, and whose needs are not being met. So I just am really grateful that we have people like David who are stepping up to tackle these issues and saying that every movement has to be inclusive. There's no room for exclusivity in a queer movement. Yeah.
So I just want to say on top of that when we spoke with the founder of the march, he actually recognized that he was a typical white male passing gay man, and he was so appreciative of the support from diverse groups, and he recognized that, and he made a point in the interview to point out his appreciation to the diversity that showed up and supported his initiative to organize the march. And I thought that was really important. And for me, these interviews and my involvement with the LGBTQ community has really, it's been special for me to understand and realize what it means to be able to express your identity, and the pride that you can take in the ability to do that, because it's never something that I've had to deal with in my life before. And my involvement with the community has really brought me to a better understanding and empathy in that respect. And I'm glad to have had the experience. Thank you all.
And I'd like to say that speaking on inclusion, I think that the Florida Queer History Project in general needs to start putting that into practice. And when I say that, I mean we need to find more researchers that can document their own experiences as queer people of color. I think that we're going to be having a more active role in finding those researchers, because it is important to show that in our own, as SPOT and as a project that agrees with these narratives that inclusion should be represented in all systems. Ours is not exempt from that.
I just want to make a quick point on this interview. I wasn't able to attend the No Justice, No Pride, but I was in DC interning with a Latin American advocacy group, and what No Justice, No Pride is protesting is the corporatization of big businesses coming in and saying, well, if we give you a rainbow flag, then you'll sponsor us. So McDonald's had, a promotion. A lot of major companies were there. Banks were there selling, giving flags to marchers at Pride. But I had spent about a month doing research for Latin American advocacy group, trying to follow the money in a case where an American military company sold expired tear gas canisters to paramilitary forces and to anti-riot police called ESMAD in Buenaventura, Colombia. And 27 people were killed because expired tear gas can be lethal. So I had spent an entire month, doing research and trying to raise awareness and lobbying efforts there. And then I went to Pride the next day, and there was that company with the flags. And I didn't really fully understand the problem with Pride, or why No Justice, No Pride was an issue, because all I saw was, McDonald's French fries in a rainbow canister. It didn't really make a difference. But for me personally, the idea of No Justice, No Pride really hit home when I saw like an American military company being at Pride and giving away the rainbow flag as if their corporate history, as if their business practices somehow weren't tied with it. So while we're doing research into identities, I would really love to see us focus more on the business side of it as well. I think that No Justice, No Pride is a movement that should get more focus and respect, because it's more than just major businesses that we view as big business. It affects millions of people, and in the case of Buenaventura, Colombia, it cost the lives of 27 people. So the No Justice, No Pride movement is really, really interesting, and I recommend y'all learn more about it.
I think we're seeing an increase in the prevalence of rainbow washing, where as sort of gay culture has become more widely accepted and more mainstream. And when I say gay culture, I mean like white, male, as straight acting as possible gay culture. So now companies are trying to sort of cash in on the cachet of homosexuality to support their often extremely oppressive business practices. So there's ways that in our efforts as queer people to assimilate, we've allowed people to use our movement to hurt other people. And that's something that I think we as humans and as activists have to be careful of moving forward.
Okay, so if we don't have any more things to say, we can open it up for questions, and just a few questions, and then we can get on. Any questions? Yes? Can you speak up a little bit? Sorry.
Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I have a few friends who are explicitly queer disability advocates in California, and there is a way that the queer movement has excluded people with disabilities. There's starting to be more acceptance of the link between queerness in America and mental disability, the way that living in this system affects our ability to live our lives. So I'm a queer man with depression and anxiety, and there's a huge number of us, a substantial proportion of queer people. There are much higher rates of mental illness. So that's something that the queer movement is starting to address, starting to provide more resources. I mean, we see things like the Trevor Project, like It Gets Better, things about queer suicide and queer mental health. I think we're starting to pivot towards including physical disabilities as well. That's one of the things in America that is very, very often left out of advocacy groups. And I think it's a key component of intersectionality that we are making space for and giving voices to queer people who feel that they're excluded from the gay narrative because of their bodies and because of their ability. Does that answer your question?
Anybody else?
If students were interested in using some of these data, let's say for a thesis project, how would they go about doing that?
So these interviews are going to be digitized and put on the UF Digital Archives through the libraries, as is the Women's March collection that is housed here at UF and featuring interviews collected all over the world, especially here in the United States. So they're not like processed and not like we've had the time to transcribe them or what have you, but also Robert and I, just kind of as the organizers of this trip and like the stewards of this project, can definitely point you in the direction. I've already done that with a researcher at Texas A&M about who's doing research
doing research about the full shooting and Latinx identity. So come to us, our office manager, but they will be online and available to the public. Anyone else? Yeah.
So when you were collecting data and speaking with people, did you collect data from every person you spoke to, or how did you decide who to conduct like a lengthy interview with? I guess because there's so many people there.
So part of that's something that we were grappled with too, because we were like, how do we go about getting like a diverse group without necessarily like tokenizing people and being like, okay, you're the number that's going to reach that capacity. So it's definitely something that we grappled with and tried to be reflective of as we were out in the field. But a lot of it was, I think, based on the organizations that we actually went to and interacted with. So as we've been talking about, we went to a Trans Women of Color collective event. We went to No Justice, No Pride. We went to Capitol Pride. So those different events attracted different people. And so just covering the bases by going to those different events, I think kind of did some of the selection process on its own. As for like time, we had some longer interviews that were purposefully going to be longer, and then some that were just shorter just because we were out in the field in the streets and just ended it quicker. But I hope that answers your question.
Any other questions? Take one more before we eat.
Where can we get the zine?
The zine?
Sorry, I don't.
Yeah.
Oh yeah, let me. I'll get that one.
Yeah, you can.
So just to also touch on this slide about the Florida Queer History Project and serving like digital and public humanities. So as we mentioned, our stuff is going to be online. We're working on digitizing the zine, but also we're printing more zines as well. And we will have them available at Third House Books downtown. We'll be on those shelves. And as you can see, forthcoming documentary, if you all want to see the trailer for that real quick. I'll be honest, we don't have an editor, so we're talking about this idea of like inclusivity. If you know of someone, let me know. But that's something we're working on currently, and we have so much rich material, and we'll be assembling that in the next few months. But I can play that really quick before we eat. Does that sound good?
Yeah.
I couldn't do nothing about who I was, so I had to accept it no matter what. At first it was hard because, I loved God, and then, I was told that I was disgracing him and, being disrespecting and going against his wishes. So it was hard. I was like, okay, well, if I love him and I love myself, but I am who I am. It was very conflicting, but I had my Bible study teacher. She was the one that really helped me accept who I was. And she told me, God loves everyone just the way they are. And she was like, and if this is who you are as a person, don't fight it. She was like, you're going to still be who you are. She was like, and you don't want to be unhappy. So you don't want to be these men out here who are married, who have kids, but stepping out on their wives. She was like, you don't want to be these people out here trying to live a life that they don't accept. And I felt like she was really speaking to me because she was like, she put the Bible to the side and everything. She was like, you're going to be an individual. You have to be who you are. You have to live in your own truth. She was like, if you like men, then you're going to like men. That's just it. She was like, God didn't make she said, there's no gay, there is no straight. She said, there's just human beings. We're all the same. So with the president that we have in the White House right now, I see it affecting us in a very good way because either way, we're going to have to come together as a unity, whether we want to or not, and we have to stand together. And we don't have to fight for the cause that we used to fight for back in the day. Because we took it back to the beginning. It's sad that it takes something bad like this to happen to bring us together, but sometimes that's what's needed.
That is concluding our panel, and I hope you guys enjoy the lovely spread that Women's Studies put together for us. Thank you so much for having us. Thank
You should have. Oh, thank you. Thank you. Thanks for having us. Thanks for supporting us.